On the day I was supposed to go home with my newborn, my husband chose a dinner reservation over us, and that was the moment everything changed. 4 days after giving birth, my body still felt like it didn't belong to me. I hadn't slept, I could barely stand, and I was holding our tiny daughter against my chest, trying to sign hospital papers with shaking hands. I kept looking at the door, waiting for him, believing he would walk in, with urgency, with love, with some sign that we mattered. But when he finally arrived, there was no rush in his steps, no warmth in his eyes. He was dressed like he was going somewhere important, just not here. He smelled like cologne, like effort spent somewhere else. When I asked about the car, thinking we would finally go home as a family, he sat down calmly and told me his parents were in town, that they had made a reservation at a fancy restaurant that they wanted to celebrate. Celebrate what? I wondered. Our baby was right here, breathing softly against me. And yet he was planning to leave her behind. Leave us behind. He spoke as if it made sense, as if I should understand, as if my exhaustion and pain were minor inconveniences compared to his plans. He even suggested I take a car service home alone with our newborn, as though that was normal, as though that was acceptable. In that moment, something inside me didn't break, it went completely still. I looked at my daughter, so small, so unaware, and I realized she deserved more than this, more than a father who could walk away this easily. I didn't scream, I didn't argue, I simply told him to go, and he did. He walked out of that hospital room, leaving behind not just his wife and child, but any illusion I still had about the life we were building. That was the moment I understood. Sometimes the loudest betrayal is the quietest one. He looked at his own newborn daughter, like she was something behind glass. And that was the moment I realized I was completely alone. There was no anger in his face, no confusion, not even guilt, just a strange, distant curiosity, like he was observing a life that had nothing to do with him. I had imagined this moment so many times, him walking and taking her into his arms, smiling with pride, whispering something soft and loving. But instead, he stood there, hands in his pockets, barely leaning, barely present. It wasn't just what he did, it was what he didn't do. He didn't ask how I was feeling after everything my body had been through. He didn't notice the exhaustion in my eyes, or the way my hands trembled as I held our daughter. He didn't reach out, didn't offer help, didn't even pretend. And the silence between us was louder than any argument we could have had. I kept searching his face for something, anything that resembled love or concern, but there was nothing to hold on to. Just emptiness, just distance. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't new. This wasn't a sudden change. This was who he had always been. I had just been too hopeful to see it clearly. The missed birthdays, the empty apologies, the way everything always revolved around him. It all came rushing back, fitting together like a truth I could no longer ignore. And standing there, holding our daughter, I understood that emotional abandonment doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the absence of care, in the lack of presence, in the way someone can stand right in front of you and still not truly be there. So tell me, have you ever felt more alone next to someone than you did by yourself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know if you've ever lived through a silence like this. When I called my father, I didn't expect him to fix everything. I just needed someone to hear me, someone who would understand without asking too many questions. My voice was steady when I told him what had happened, but inside, I felt like I was barely holding myself together. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, not the kind filled with confusion, but the kind filled with quiet certainty. And then he said he would be there soon. He didn't ask if I was sure, didn't offer advice over the phone, didn't try to explain anything away. He just showed up. And somehow, that meant more than anything else. When he walked into the hospital room, still wearing his work clothes, tie slightly loosened, I felt something shift inside me. He didn't rush into anger, didn't demand answers, didn't make the moment about himself. He came straight to me, placed his hands gently on my face, and looked at me in a way that said everything words couldn't. He asked if I was okay, and for the first time I allowed myself to answer honestly. Not strong, not pretending, just real. He then looked at my daughter, so small and fragile, and there was a softness in his expression that I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was steady, grounded, and certain. He helped me get everything ready, without making it feel like a burden. He carried the car seat, walked beside me, and made sure I didn't feel alone for a single moment. During the drive home, he didn't bring up my husband, didn't push me to talk about what had happened. Instead, he spoke about simple things, about my daughter's name, about a small bird building a nest on his porch. It was such an ordinary conversation, but in that moment it felt like the most comforting thing in the world. And I realized something important. Real love doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or perfect words. It shows up quietly, consistently, and without hesitation. It doesn't leave when things get difficult. It stays. Looking back, I realized the truth had always been there. I had just chosen not to see it clearly. The signs were never hidden, never complicated, just easy to excuse when you wanted something to work badly enough. I remembered the birthdays I spent alone, telling myself he was busy, that his work mattered, that I was being understanding, when in reality, I was being forgotten. I remembered the holidays that somehow always revolved around his family, their traditions, their preferences, while mine became optional, secondary, something we would make up for later. Later rarely came. I remembered the way he spoke about my father's company, reducing years of hard work into a joke, calling it something small, something insignificant, while I laughed along pretending it didn't bother me. But it did. It always did. And then there were the quieter moments, the ones that didn't seem serious enough at the time to question. The way he would check his phone in the middle of conversations, the way he would agree to things without really listening, the way he made me feel like I was asking for too much whenever I needed emotional support. Each moment on its own felt small, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I started to see that he had always been present only when it was easy, when it required nothing from him, when it fit into his plans. But the moment something demanded effort, patience, or sacrifice, he stepped back. I told myself stories to make it make sense, that he just wasn't expressive, that he showed love differently, that relationships required compromise. And maybe that was partly true, but compromise is not supposed to feel like losing yourself piece by piece. It's not supposed to feel like constantly shrinking so someone else can stay comfortable. Standing there in that hospital room holding my daughter, all those memories stopped feeling like isolated moments and started feeling like a single, undeniable truth. He had shown me who he was, again and again. I was the one who kept rewriting the meaning, and in that moment I finally stopped. I thought the worst part was being abandoned in that hospital room until I found out what he had been doing behind my back. When my father's lawyer sat across from me and began laying out the truth, I felt something colder than shock. It wasn't just betrayal, it was calculation. Over the course of our marriage, he had quietly used my personal credit account, not the shared one, not something accidental, but something deliberate, something hidden. The charges weren't small, and they weren't rare. They stretched back over months, building into an amount that I couldn't ignore even if I wanted to. Hotels in cities he claimed he never visited, dinners I was never invited to, transfers I had never approved. Each detail felt like another piece of a life I didn't know existed. And then it got worse. Before we were even married, he had already found a way into my father's company, creating a false image, presenting opportunities that weren't real, and collecting money for work that never happened. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was a pattern, a strategy. And sitting there, listening to it all, I realized something that changed everything. He hadn't just failed me as a husband. He had chosen to deceive me from the very beginning. Every smile, every promise, every plan for the future suddenly felt different, like I was seeing them through a lens that finally made sense. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat there, very still, understanding that the life I thought I had was built on something that was never real. And strangely, that clarity felt powerful, because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And that means you can finally act. So I want to ask you this. If you discovered someone you trusted had been living a completely different life behind your back, what would you do? Would you walk away immediately? Or would you try to understand why? Drop your thoughts in the comment. And if this story makes you feel something, don't forget to like and subscribe, because some truths deserve to be heard. The moment I decided to act, everything inside me shifted from confusion to clarity. There was no more second guessing, No more searching for explanations that could somehow soften what had already been revealed. The truth was complete, and for the first time, I allowed myself to respond to it without hesitation. The prenuptial agreement that once felt like a formality suddenly became the foundation of my protection. Every detail that had been written into it, every clause I had barely thought about at the time now, stood between me and the life he had been quietly taking from me. With my father's attorney guiding every step, the process moved quickly and decisively. Within a single day, the necessary documents were prepared and filed, formally initiating the separation of everything that had once been shared. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. He was notified that he no longer had access to anything connected to my name, that the home we lived in was no longer his to enter freely, and that his presence there had an end date that was not negotiable. The accounts were secured, the cards were reported, and every pathway he had used to maintain control was systematically closed. When he began calling, I did not answer. At first, the messages sounded almost convincing apologies, layered with explanations, promises that things would change, that he had made mistakes, that he needed another chance. But as the hours passed, the tone shifted. The apologies became frustration. The frustration became anger, and the anger revealed something far more honest than any apology ever could. It confirmed what I already knew: this was never about regret. It was about losing access, and I refused to give that access back. Each call was documented, each message saved, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was acting intentionally. When he finally appeared at the house, standing outside with words he had clearly rehearsed, I listened from a distance I had never created before. He spoke about family, about our child, about fixing what was broken, but his words no longer had weight. They no longer reached me in the same way, because I had already seen what stood behind them. I chose not to open the door, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Some doors once closed with truth should never be reopened with excuses. The days that followed were not easy, but they were steady. There was a rhythm to rebuilding, to reclaiming space that had slowly been taken. And in that process, I realized something powerful. Walking away is not weakness. It is not failure. It is the moment you decide that your life will no longer be shaped by someone else's deception. By the time the legal actions moved forward beyond the initial steps, I no longer felt like I was losing anything. I felt like I was finally protecting what had always been mine, and that changed everything. By the time the case moved forward into the legal system, I no longer felt overwhelmed. I felt prepared. What had once been a deeply personal betrayal had now become a matter of evidence, documentation, and accountability. The emotional chaos that had defined those first days was replaced by something far more structured. Every transaction, every unauthorized charge, every false claim he had made was no longer just a memory. It was a record, and records don't argue, they don't twist the truth. They simply exist. When the formal charges were filed, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like a natural consequence of choices he had made long before I ever knew about them. The process was not fast, but it was steady. There were meetings, statements, reviews of documents that detailed a version of my life I had never seen while I was living it. Sitting across from attorneys, I listened as they broke everything down into clear, undeniable facts. The numbers were no longer abstract. They told a story of intention, repetition, and planning. This wasn't a single mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was a pattern that had been carefully maintained over time. When the case finally reached the courtroom, I was surprised by how calm I felt. I had imagined fear, anger, maybe even hesitation, but what I felt instead was distance. Not indifference, but clarity. He sat across from me, no longer the person I had once trusted, but someone I could now see without confusion. His attorney spoke, attempting to reshape the narrative, to introduce doubt, to present him as misunderstood rather than responsible. But the evidence didn't leave room for that version of the story. Piece by piece, everything was laid out, each detail reinforcing the same conclusion. I watched as the confidence he once carried began to fade, replaced by something far less certain. And in that moment, I understood that truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be consistent. The waiting that followed the time while the decision was being made was perhaps the only part that tested me. not because I feared the outcome, but because it required patience. There was nothing left for me to do but trust the process I had already committed to. And when the decision finally came, it wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden release, no overwhelming reaction, just a quiet confirmation that everything had led to this point. He was held accountable. The system had done what it was designed to do. And as I stood there, I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved, because this was never about winning. It was about truth being recognized for what it was. Walking out of that courtroom, I realized that justice doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't give back time or undo pain. But it does something equally important. It draws a clear line between what was acceptable and what was not. And sometimes that line is what allows you to finally move forward without looking back. In the end, what stayed with me wasn't the betrayal, the court case, or even the outcome. It was the quiet realization of what love truly looks like. For a long time, I believed love had to be proven through big gestures, through words that sounded perfect, through moments that felt intense and unforgettable. I thought love was supposed to feel like something you chase, something you hold on to tightly, because you're afraid it might disappear. But everything I went through forced me to see something different, something far more real. Love is not in the grand entrance. It's in who stays when the room is empty. It's not in the promises, it's in the consistency. It's not in how someone makes you feel on your best days, but how they show up on your worst ones. When I look back now, the clearest image in my mind is not of my husband walking away, but of my father walking in. No hesitation, no questions, no conditions, just presence, just certainty. And in that simple act, he showed me more about love than anything else ever had. It made me realize that love isn't something you should have to question. It shouldn't leave you guessing, wondering if you matter, or if you're asking for too much. Real love doesn't make you shrink. It doesn't ask you to become less, so someone else can feel more comfortable. It meets you where you are, and stands beside you, without needing to be asked. As I started rebuilding my life, I stopped focusing on what I had lost, and started paying attention to what had always been there. The small things became everything. The quiet mornings, the steady routines, the feeling of safety that didn't depend on anyone's mood or approval. I watched my daughter grow, and with every small moment, I understood more clearly the kind of life I wanted to create for her. A life where love is not confusing, a life where presence matters more than words, a life where she never has to question her worth. And in teaching her that, I found myself learning it too. I no longer measure love by intensity, I measure it by reliability. By who shows up, who stays, who listens, who cares, without needing recognition. Because at the end of everything, those are the things that remain. Not the noise, not the drama, not the illusion, but the quiet, steady truth of who was really there. If there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's this. Losing the wrong person is not a loss, it's a correction. It clears the space for something honest. Something grounded. Something that doesn't need to be questioned. So if you're holding on to something that constantly makes you doubt yourself, ask yourself why. Ask yourself what love really feels like, not in moments of excitement, but in moments of silence. And most importantly, ask yourself if you're being shown the kind of love you truly deserve. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the quietest truths.